Elena sat quietly in the back row of the large university concert hall. The air inside the room felt heavy, mostly because it was packed with students who were nervous about the day ahead. It was the annual master class, a special event where a famous pianist came to give advice and criticism. For music students, this was the most important day of the year. Being picked to play was a huge honor, but it was also very scary. You had to be perfect, or you would be embarrassed in front of everyone. Elena was a talented girl, but she was not the loud type. She didn't brag about her skills like some of the other students. While others talked loudly about how many hours they practiced, Elena just kept her head down and did the work. She loved the piano more than anything. The instrument was her way of speaking when she couldn't find the right words. She had spent the last 3 months preparing for this specific day. She knew exactly what piece she wanted to play if she got the chance, but she kept it a secret. At the front of the hall stood a sleek, black grand piano. Next to it sat Maestro Vance. He was a guest instructor who was famous all over the world. He was known for his amazing technique, but he was also known for being very arrogant. He believed that music should be played with power and aggression. He often looked down on students who were shy or gentle. He thought they were too weak to handle the difficult classical music. As he walked onto the stage, his shoes clicked loudly on the wooden floor. He didn't smile. He just looked at the crowd of students with a cold stare, like a general inspecting his troops. The class began, and one by one, students went up to play. Maestro Vance was not kind. He stopped them frequently. He criticized their hand positions, their timing, and their emotional expression. He made a few students cry with his harsh words. The atmosphere in the room grew tense. Everyone was trying to be invisible, hoping not to be called next. Everyone except Elena, that is. She had a feeling that he was going to pick her. She had prepared a piece that was known as The Tempest. It was a composition by a famous composer that was widely considered technically unplayable. The notes moved so fast that most pianists' fingers would get tangled up. It required a level of speed and precision that very few people in the world had. Maestro Vance paused and looked around the room, rubbing his chin. He had heard a rumor that a student had actually managed to learn this impossible piece. He wanted to see if this was true, not because he wanted to be impressed, but because he wanted to prove it was a waste of time. He didn't think a student at this level could handle it. His eyes scanned the rows of chairs until they landed on Elena. He remembered seeing her name on the participant list. He didn't know her well, but she looked too small, too quiet, to play something so powerful. "You there," Vance said, pointing a finger directly at her. His voice boomed through the microphone. "The young lady in the gray sweater. Come up here." Elena's heart jumped into her throat. She stood up slowly, her legs feeling a little shaky. She could feel hundreds of eyes turning to look at her. She grabbed her folder of sheet music and walked down the aisle. The walk to the stage felt like the longest walk of her life. With every step, she tried to calm her breathing. She told herself that she knew the music. She had practiced until her fingers hurt. But the look on Maestro Vance's face made her doubt herself. He wasn't looking at her with encouragement. He was looking at her like she was a bug he was about to step on. When she reached the stage, she stood next to the piano. The lights were brighter here, and she felt a little dizzy. Maestro Vance didn't offer his hand to shake. He just stood up and moved away from the bench, gesturing for her to take his place. "I have been told you have prepared something special," Vance said, his voice dripping with skepticism. He turned to the audience. Is this true? Do we have a virtuoso hiding in the back row? A few students murmured, but no one answered. They were all afraid of him too. Elena cleared her throat softly. Yes, sir, she said, her voice sounding small in the large hall. I have prepared the Tempest. A few people in the audience gasped quietly. They knew how hard that piece was. Maestro Vance raised an eyebrow, a smirk forming on his lips. This was exactly what he wanted. He wanted to see her try and fail. He believed that playing this piece wasn't just about hitting the right notes, it was about having a specific personality. He thought a shy girl couldn't pull it off. The Tempest, he repeated, laughing dryly. A bold choice. He walked around the piano, looking at her critically. You know, this piece requires more than just fingers. It requires fire. It requires anger. It requires a dominance over the instrument. He looked her up and down. Forgive me for saying, but you do not look like a person who has much anger inside you. Elena held onto her music folder tightly. She didn't say anything. She just waited for him to tell her to start. She could feel the sweat on her palms. Maestro Vance leaned against the side of the piano, crossing his arms. He decided to test her. He didn't want her to just play, he wanted to see if she would break under pressure first. He wanted to humiliate her a little before she even played a note, to show the class that arrogance without talent was a mistake. I am going to be honest with you, Vance said, loud enough for the back row to hear. Most professionals cannot play this piece well. They attempt it, and they crash. It becomes a mess of noise. He looked at the students in the front row. I believe in knowing one's limitations. That is the mark of a true musician. Do you know your limitations, Elena? She looked at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. I think I can play it, sir. He laughed again, a sharp, mocking sound. You think that is not confidence? He stood up straight and walked over to the bench. Sit, he commanded. Elena sat down on the bench. It was comfortable, but she felt stiff. She opened her folder and pulled out the sheet music. It was covered in pencil marks, notes she had written for herself during late-night practice sessions. She placed the music on the stand. Vance looked down at the music. Before you begin, he said, interrupting her preparation. I want to offer you a way out. There is a sonata by the same composer. It is much simpler. It is pretty, it is safe, and it suits your demeanor. Why don't you play that instead? If you try to play the Tempest, you will only embarrass yourself in front of all these people. It is better to play a simple piece perfectly than to destroy a masterpiece. Don't you agree? The room was deadly silent. Everyone knew what he was doing. He was telling her that she wasn't good enough. He was telling her that she was too weak to handle the challenge. He was setting her up. If she refused, she looked stubborn. If she accepted, she looked weak. And if she tried to play and failed, she would be a laughingstock. Elena looked at the keys of the piano. They were black and white, waiting for her. She thought about the months of practice. She thought about the blisters on her fingers. She thought about the lonely nights in the practice room while everyone else was at parties. She had poured her soul into this music. She knew she wasn't the strongest person in the room, and she wasn't the loudest. But she knew this piece. She knew every note, every rest, every dynamic change. She took a deep breath and looked up at Maestro Vance. Thank you for the advice, sir, she said politely. But I would like to play the Tempest. Vance's smirk faded into a cold mask. He didn't like being defied, especially not by a student he considered inferior. He stepped back, clasping his hands behind his back. He had decided that he would let her play, but he would make sure the stakes were high. He wanted to use her failure as a lesson for everyone else. "Very well," he said, his voice hard. "If you insist on making a mistake, who am I to stop you?" He turned to the audience, raising his voice so everyone could hear him clearly. "Listen closely, everyone. This is what happens when ego exceeds talent. When she begins to crash, and she will, do not clap. Do not encourage her. Silence is the best teacher for those who reach too high. Let her play, and let her learn the hard way." Elena felt a surge of anger in her chest. It was small at first, like a spark, but it grew quickly. Who was he to decide her fate? Who was he to say she would fail before she even touched a key? She placed her hands on the keyboard, her fingers trembling just a little bit. She closed her eyes for a brief second to shut out the room, to shut out his arrogant face, and to find the music inside her head. She wasn't playing for him anymore. She was playing for herself. She was going to show him that fire doesn't always have to be loud and aggressive. Sometimes, fire is quiet, steady, and unstoppable. She was ready. The atmosphere in the concert hall was suffocating. It felt as though all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room the moment Maestro Vance issued his cruel command. He stood with his arms crossed, looking down at Elena not as a teacher looks at a student, but as a critic looks at a painting he has already decided to hate. He had made his bet, and he was betting on her failure. He wanted her to crumble. He wanted her to feel so small that she would walk off the stage before playing even a single note. That was his game. It wasn't about music anymore, it was about power. Elena sat on the bench, her back rigid. She could feel the hundreds of eyes piercing into her. The other students were holding their breath. They felt sorry for her, but they were also relieved it wasn't them sitting in the hot seat. In the music world, there is a strange kind of survival instinct that makes you glad when the spotlight is on someone else's mistake. But as they looked at Elena's small frame hunched over the massive piano, a few of them began to feel a sense of pity. They knew what the maestro was doing. He was setting a trap, and he had just forced her to walk right into it. Maestro Vance didn't leave the stage. Instead, he began to pace slowly around the piano. The sound of his shoes on the wooden floor was rhythmic and deliberate, like a ticking clock. It was a psychological trick designed to distract her. He wanted her to focus on him, not on the music. Every time he passed by her, he would sigh loudly or shake his head, as if he already disappointed in a performance that hadn't started yet. He was trying to get inside her head, to plant seeds of doubt that would grow into panic. "You seem tense," Vance said suddenly, stopping right behind her. His voice wasn't loud, but in the silent hall, it sounded like a shout. He leaned in slightly, invading her personal space. "Your shoulders are up by your ears. That is a sign of fear. And fear is the enemy of technique. If you are afraid of the piano will eat you alive." Elena didn't turn around. She stared at the black and white keys. They were her friends usually, but today they looked like a mountain she was being asked to climb without any gear. She took a slow, deep breath, trying to lower her shoulders as he suggested, but it was difficult. Her muscles were locked tight. She could feel a bead of sweat making its way down her spine. She wanted to wipe it away, but she didn't dare move. She knew that any movement she made would be analyzed and judged. Vance walked around to the side of the piano and looked at the sheet music she had placed on the stand. He shook his head again, clicking his tongue against his teeth. This edition, he said, picking up the corner of the paper as if it were dirty. This is the difficult version. Why do you make things hard for yourself, or are you trying to prove a point? He looked at the audience, a sarcastic smile on his face. Students often think that if they play the hardest version of the hardest piece, they will be famous. They confuse difficulty with artistry. He looked back at Elena. Let me save you some time. If you play this, and you miss the jumps in the second measure, which you almost certainly will, you will look foolish. Why not switch? I have a simple sonata right here on my podium. It is charming. It is safe. People will like it. It was a temptation. A safe way out. If she agreed to play the simple sonata, the pressure would vanish. The maestro would be nice to her. He would nod and smile, and the class would move on. No one would humiliate her. But Elena knew that if she switched now, she would never respect herself again. It wasn't about being famous, it was about the work she had done. She had spent hundreds of hours learning this specific piece because she loved it, because it spoke to her. To switch to a simple sonata just to please this arrogant man would be a betrayal of herself. No, thank you, Elena said. Her voice was a little stronger this time, though it still wavered slightly. I would like to play this one. Vance let out a dramatic sigh, throwing his hands up in the air. Stubbornness, he announced to the room. It is the curse of the mediocre. They think stubbornness is talent. It is not. He walked back to the center of the stage. Very well. If you are determined to embarrass yourself, I will not stop you. But remember my rule. If the train crashes, do not applaud. Let the silence teach her. He stepped back into the shadows near the curtains, crossing his arms again. He looked like a vulture waiting for its meal. The silence in the room stretched out, heavy and uncomfortable. Elena felt a wave of loneliness wash over her. It was just her and the instrument now. She looked at her hands. They were shaking a little. She flexed her fingers, feeling the tension in her joints. She closed her eyes for a moment and tried to visualize the music. She remembered why she loved The Tempest. It wasn't just noise, it was a story. It started with a chaotic storm, full of rage and confusion, just like the situation she was in right now. But then, in the middle of the piece, there was a calmness. A beautiful, singing melody that floated above the chaos. It was the eye of the storm. That was the part she loved the most. It represented peace. She knew she could play that part. She just had to get through the storm first. The maestro began to tap his foot loudly. He was impatient. He was waiting for her to start so she could fail, and he could move on with his lecture. He wanted her to rush, to panic, to start before she was ready. It was another trick. Elena realized that if she let him dictate her speed, she had already lost. She ignored his tapping foot. She ignored his heavy breathing. She listened to her own heartbeat. Slowly, she placed her fingers on the starting notes. Her left hand found a low A, and her right hand hovered over the higher octaves. The piano felt cold under her fingertips. She took one last deep breath, filling her lungs with air, and then let it out slowly. She imagined a bubble around herself, a transparent shield that blocked out the maestro's voice, blocked out the staring students, and blocked out the fear. In this bubble, there was only her and the music. Maestro Vance rolled his eyes. He checked his watch. He was making a show of how bored he was. He looked at the front row of students and gave them a see what I mean look. He was confident she was going to freeze. He thought he had broken her spirit. He thought his psychological pressure was too much for a young girl to handle. He had seen it 1,000 times before, talented kids who folded the moment someone challenged them. But he was wrong. Underneath her quiet exterior, Elena had a core of steel. She had faced difficulties in her life that knew nothing of concert halls or famous pianists. She knew that sometimes, the only way to shut out a loud, cruel world was to make your own voice heard. And on the piano, her voice was loud. She adjusted her posture. She lifted her wrists slightly, just as her own teacher had taught her years ago. She didn't look at the maestro. She didn't look at her friends in the audience. She looked only at the music. It was a blur of black ink on white paper, but to her, it was a road map. She knew exactly where she was going. Vance stopped tapping his foot. He sensed a shift in her energy. The girl who had looked terrified a moment ago suddenly looked different. She wasn't looking at him. She wasn't looking for approval. She was looking inward. For a split second, a flash of doubt crossed his mind. He wondered, just for a moment, if maybe the rumors were true. Maybe she actually could play it. But he quickly pushed that thought away. It was impossible. Nobody mastered that piece at her age. It was a fluke if she even got through the first page. He cleared his throat loudly, a final attempt to rattle her just before she began. "Whenever you are ready," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Or whenever you stop shaking." Elena heard the comment, but she didn't react. She was past the point of reacting to him. She was in her zone. She pressed the key for the low A with her left hand, hearing the deep, resonant sound vibrate through the floorboards. It was the sound of a thunderclap. It was the beginning of the storm. She was ready to dive in. The trap was set, the stage was dark, and the maestro was waiting for his victory. But in the next few moments, he was about to realize that he had made a very serious mistake. He had tried to humiliate her, but he had only succeeded in waking her up. The air in the concert hall felt thick enough to choke on. It was that terrible, heavy silence that happens right before something bad occurs, or right before a major disaster. Maestro Vance stood just a few feet away, his arms still crossed tightly against his chest. He looked like a statue of a man who had seen too much and liked none of it. His eyes were fixed on Elena, not with hope, but with a cold, analytical glare. He was waiting for the crack. He was waiting for that one moment of hesitation that would prove him right. He wanted to turn to the students behind him and say, "See, I told you. Ambition without talent is just noise." Elena sat on the bench, her hands hovering over the keys. Her heart was beating so hard that she could feel it thumping against her ribs, like a bird trapped in a cage. For a brief second, a terrifying thought flashed through her mind: what if he is right? What if she had practiced for months only to realize she wasn't good enough? The fear was a cold weight in her stomach. But then, she felt the rough texture of the piano keys under her fingertips. She remembered the countless hours she had spent in the practice room, the lonely nights, the frustration, and the joy of finally getting it right. This wasn't about Vance. It wasn't about the audience. It was about the truth she had found in that music. She realized that she wasn't playing to please him anymore, she was playing to survive him. She took a deep, shaky breath and closed her eyes for just a second longer. When she opened them, the fear was still there, but it had changed. It wasn't a wall stopping her, it was fuel. She didn't look at the maestro. She didn't look for reassurance from the crowd. She looked straight at the sheet music. The notes were no longer just ink on a page, they were a map, and she knew exactly where she was going. Then, her hands moved. The opening notes of The Tempest are not soft. They are an explosion of sound. Elena struck the keys with a force that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. The sound wasn't just loud, it was aggressive and sharp. It cut through the thick silence like a knife. The initial chord rang out, vibrating through the floorboards and up into the seats where the students sat. For the first 30 seconds, the room was paralyzed. The students leaned forward in their seats, their eyes wide. They were expecting a mess. They were expecting her to fumble the complex rhythms right at the start. But she didn't. Her left hand moved in a driving, rhythmic pattern while her right hand jumped across the octaves. The piece is physically demanding. It requires the pianist to stretch their hands to the limit, moving at blinding speeds. Most people who attempt this piece end up sounding muddy and confused, like a person tripping over their own feet. But Elena's playing was surprisingly clean. Every note was distinct, every rhythm was precise. It was as if her fingers had a mind of their own, separate from the anxiety that was coursing through the rest of her body. Maestro Vance shifted his weight. He uncrossed his arms and let them hang by his sides. The smirk that had been plastered on his face was beginning to fade, replaced by a look of intense scrutiny. He walked a step closer to the piano, tilting his head to listen better. He was looking for the errors. He was hunting for the missed notes, waiting for the inevitable moment where the tempo would slow down because it was too difficult to maintain. He was a professional critic, and he knew how to find flaws. But the problem was, he couldn't hear any. The music was chaotic, swirling and turning like a storm, but there was a control to it. Elena's fingers were flying over the keys, hitting the right notes with a precision that was almost scary. She was playing the impossible section, the part that had humiliated professional pianists for decades. The jumps were wide, forcing her to move her hands instantly from the low end of the piano to the high end. It was a test of muscle memory and faith. If she looked down at her hands, she would miss the notes. If she hesitated, she would fall behind. She had to trust her training completely. The students in the audience stopped breathing. The atmosphere in the hall shifted completely. Just a minute ago, they had been feeling sorry for her. They had been bracing themselves for the awkward moment when she would have to stop in the middle of the song because she couldn't keep up. But now, they were witnessing something else. They were watching a transformation. The quiet girl in the gray sweater was gone. In her place was a musician of incredible power. She was attacking the piano with a fierceness they didn't know she possessed. Vance took another step closer. He was now standing right next to the piano, looking over her shoulder. He could see her hands. They were a blur of motion. He saw the tension in her shoulders, which she still hadn't managed to relax completely, but he also saw the absolute determination in her technique. She was playing the piece exactly as it was written, without simplifying a single note. He watched her fingers execute a complicated run of notes that sounded like a cascade of water falling down a cliff. It was perfect. A frown appeared on his forehead. This wasn't supposed to be happening. His plan to humiliate her was falling apart, and he didn't know how to stop it without looking like a bully. Elena didn't notice any of this. She was in a different world. As the music continued, she stopped thinking about the notes. She had practiced them so much that her muscles took over. Her mind was free to focus on the emotion of the piece. She remembered the feeling of being small and ignored, the feeling of being told she wasn't good enough. She poured all of that frustration into the keys. She wasn't just playing music, she was fighting back. Every loud chord was a shout against the people who had doubted her. Every fast run was a sprint away from the fear that had held her back for so long. The piece moved into its next section, which was even faster. The tempo picked up, demanding a speed that seemed inhuman. This was the point where most players crashed. It was the wall. The rhythm became tricky, switching gears unexpectedly. It felt like trying to run on ice. The audience flinched collectively, thinking this was it. This was the moment she would slip. But Elena didn't slip. She didn't slow down. If anything, she played faster. She leaned into the piano, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm. She was taking risks, playing on the edge of control, but she never fell off. Her fingers knew exactly where to go. It was a display of physical and mental strength that left everyone stunned. Maestro Vance stood there, completely still now. The condescending look was gone. In its place was a look of shock. He glanced at the audience and saw that their attention was entirely on Elena. They were no longer looking at him for cues. They were captivated by the music. He had lost control of the room. The girl he had tried to break was commanding the stage. She wasn't asking for his approval, she was demanding his respect, and she was doing it through the language he thought he owned. As Elena played on, the sweat was dripping down her face, but she didn't wipe it away. Her hands were beginning to ache from the exertion, but she didn't stop. She pushed through the pain, driven by an adrenaline she had never felt before. She was playing better than she ever had in the practice room. The stakes were high, and instead of freezing, she was rising to the occasion. She was proving, note by note, that his assessment of her was wrong. She wasn't weak. She wasn't safe. She was a force of nature. The music swelled to a deafening volume. The sound filled every corner of the massive hall. It was angry, it was beautiful, and it was undeniably difficult. Vance stood by the piano, his arms hanging limp, his face a mask of disbelief. He had tried to humiliate her, thinking she would crumble like a dry leaf. Instead, she had turned into a storm. He realized, with a sinking feeling in his gut, that he had made a terrible mistake. He had woken up a sleeping giant, and now there was nothing he could do but listen. The chaotic storm of notes that had filled the concert hall began to shift. The opening section of The Tempest was all about rage, speed, and power. Elena had navigated that dangerous part with a fierce determination that shocked everyone, including herself. But now, the music was changing. The piece moved from the loud, crashing thunder into a section that was much more difficult in a different way. It became quiet, intricate, and incredibly delicate. This was the part that separated good pianists from great ones. This was the part where you couldn't hide behind loud noise, you had to bare your soul. Elena's fingers slowed down. Instead of pounding the keys, she now had to caress them. The notes were light and scattered, like raindrops falling on a roof. The silence between the notes became just as important as the notes themselves. In a large hall, playing quietly is much harder than playing loudly. You have to control the sound so perfectly that it reaches the very back row without fading away. If you are too timid, the sound dies. If you are too heavy, the magic is lost. The audience leaned forward in their seats, straining to hear. The tension in the room was different now. It wasn't the tension of waiting for a crash, it was the tension of being pulled into a story. Maestro Vance, who had been standing stiffly near the piano, narrowed his eyes. He knew this section was the true test. He had expected her to rush through the quiet parts to get back to the loud, impressive chords. That is what most students do, they are afraid of silence. But Elena didn't rush. She held the tempo steady. She played with a softness that was heartbreaking. It was as if she was whispering a secret to the entire room. Vance uncrossed his arms and took a small step closer to the piano. He couldn't help himself. He was actually listening now. The arrogance on his face was replaced by a look of intense focus. He was searching for a flaw, any sign that she was struggling, but her control was absolute. As Elena played, she felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. The fear was still there, sitting in the back of her mind, but it was no longer in control. For the first time since she walked onto the stage, she stopped thinking about Maestro Vance. She forgot about his cruel comments and his attempt to humiliate her. She forgot about the hundreds of students watching her. Her world shrank down to just her hands and the vibrations of the strings inside the piano. She was telling a story through the music. It was a story about overcoming anger. The loud, angry beginning had represented the humiliation and the bullying. But this quiet, beautiful middle section represented her own strength. It was the moment when you realize that you don't have to scream to be heard. She played a melody that soared high up the keyboard. It was a lonely, haunting tune. She hit the high notes with a crystal clarity that made the piano sound like a bell. The sound seemed to hang in the air, sparkling and pure. A few of the students in the front row closed their eyes. They weren't judging her technique anymore, they were just feeling the music. It was a transformative moment. The girl who had been told she had no fire was proving that she had the deepest fire of all, the fire of endurance and expression. Then, the music began to build again. The quiet section was over. The melody grew louder, the chords became thicker, and the rhythm started to drive forward again. They were heading toward the finale, the most technically demanding part of the entire piece. This was where the music became a blur of notes again. This was where the tempest earned its name. Elena took a deep breath and braced herself. She knew her hands were getting tired. She had been playing with intense concentration, and her muscles were beginning to burn. But she also knew that this was her chance. She couldn't just play the notes correctly, she had to attack them. She launched into the final movement. It was a torrent of sound. Her hands crossed over each other constantly, one hand playing low on the keyboard while the other jumped over the top to play the high notes. It looked like a complicated dance, or perhaps a magic trick. It was visually dazzling to watch. The audience gasped as they saw her hands moving so fast they were almost a blur. The sound was overwhelming, filling the entire hall with a wall of sound. Maestro Vance took a step back, his mouth opening slightly. He had played this piece himself many times. He knew exactly how hard it was. He knew the physical stamina required to make it sound this easy. Watching Elena, he realized that she wasn't just surviving the piece, she was conquering it. She was playing with a level of virtuosity that was rare to see in a master class, let alone from a student he had tried to dismiss. He looked at the audience and saw that they were mesmerized. He had lost the room completely. His authority was gone, evaporated by the sheer power of her talent. He felt a strange mix of emotions: annoyance that he had been wrong, but also a genuine, grudging respect for the girl who refused to break. Elena felt the adrenaline surging through her veins. She was in the zone that athletes talk about. She wasn't thinking about individual notes anymore. Her hands knew what to do. It was a feeling of pure freedom. All the times she had been told she was too quiet, too weak, too insignificant, she was using all of that to fuel her playing. She was throwing every ounce of her energy into the piano. The sound she was creating was massive. It was bigger than she was. It felt like the piano was singing for her, shouting out all the things she had been too afraid to say. The music reached a fever pitch. The rhythm became frantic, the chords crashing like waves against rocks. It was chaotic and terrifyingly fast. This was the moment where the impossible jumps happened. Elena didn't flinch. She slammed her hands down on the keys with perfect precision, landing the jumps with a heavy, resonant thud that vibrated through the floor. She was taking risks, pushing the tempo faster than she had ever dared in practice. It was dangerous. If she missed one note now, the whole thing could fall apart. But she didn't miss. She was riding the edge of the storm, and she was in total control. Her face was flushed red, and a strand of hair had fallen loose from her ponytail, sticking to her forehead. She didn't brush it away. She didn't move anything except her arms and hands. She was laser-focused. The physical exertion was immense. Her forearms burned, but she pushed through the pain. She channeled the humiliation she had felt at the beginning of the class into the music. Every note was a rebuttal to Maestro Vance's arrogance. She was showing him, and everyone else, that true strength isn't about how loud you can talk or how hard you can stare someone down. True strength is about resilience. It's about being knocked down and getting back up to deliver something beautiful. The finale was approaching. The music was climbing higher and higher, building up to the final chord. The tension was unbearable. The entire hall was on the edge of their seats. Even the maestro was leaning forward, his eyes locked on her hands. The sound grew louder and louder, filling every corner of the space, drowning out the world. Elena felt like she was flying. She wasn't the shy student anymore. She was a master of her craft. She poured every last bit of energy she had into the final run. Her fingers flew across the keys, a blur of motion, a flash of black and white. She wasn't holding anything back. She gave it everything. This was her moment, and she was seizing it with both hands. The music built up to a point where it felt like the room might explode. The notes were coming faster than ever, a chaotic mix of thunder and lightning. Elena's hands were flying across the keyboard, moving with a speed and power that seemed impossible for someone her size. She was giving it everything she had. Every muscle in her body was tight, focused entirely on the music. She could feel the sweat on her forehead, and her heart felt like it was beating in time with the rhythm. She wasn't holding back a single ounce of energy. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment where she could finally prove to herself, and to everyone else, that she belonged here. Then, came the final run. It was a series of cascading notes that tumbled down the keyboard like a waterfall, rushing toward the very last chord. Elena didn't slow down. She didn't hesitate. She trusted her hands completely. Her fingers struck the final chords with a massive amount of force, not just loud, but deep and resonant. It was the kind of sound that vibrates through your chest. Bam! Bam! The final two notes rang out, sharp and decisive, cutting through the air like a knife. And then, she stopped. Elena lifted her hands off the keys and placed them gently in her lap. The sudden silence was deafening. The final chord didn't fade away immediately, it seemed to hang in the air above the audience, echoing off the high ceilings of the concert hall. It was a heavy, powerful silence. No one moved. No one spoke. It felt like the entire room was holding its breath, afraid that if they made a sound, the magic would break. Elena sat there on the bench, her chest heaving up and down. She was gasping for air, exhausted. Her hands were trembling slightly from the effort, and her face was bright red. For a few seconds, she kept her eyes closed, just listening to the sound fading away. She was trying to come back to reality, to leave the storm of the music and return to the quiet hall. She knew she had played well. She knew she hadn't made any major mistakes. But in that moment of silence, her old fears tried to creep back in. Was it enough? Did they like it, or was Maestro Vance right, and it was all just noise? Slowly, she opened her eyes. She looked out at the audience, but she couldn't really see anyone's face clearly because the stage lights were so bright. She just saw a blur of shapes. Then, she looked to her side, where Maestro Vance was standing. The maestro stood frozen. His arms were hanging loosely by his sides, a position that looked completely uncharacteristic for a man who always tried to look so perfect and in control. His face was blank. The arrogance, the smirk, the cruel sarcasm, all of it was gone. In its place was a look of total shock. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. He had been so sure that she would fail, so confident that he would be able to use her as a bad example. Instead, he had just witnessed a performance that was better than many professionals he had worked with. He didn't know how to react. For the first time in years, he was speechless. Then, the reaction began. It started in the back of the hall. Someone let out a loud, "Whoa." Then, another person began to clap. Suddenly, the silence shattered. It wasn't just polite clapping, it was a roar. The entire audience erupted. Hundreds of students stood up from their seats almost all at once. They were cheering, whistling, and shouting. It was a tidal wave of noise that was even louder than the piano had been. They weren't clapping because they were being nice. They were clapping because they had just witnessed something incredible. They had watched a quiet girl stand up to a bully and win using nothing but her talent. Elena sat on the bench, stunned by the noise. A smile slowly spread across her face, but it was a shy smile. She felt a lump in her throat and tears stinging her eyes. She had never received applause like this before. It was overwhelming. She looked out at the sea of standing students and realized that she wasn't the invisible girl in the back row anymore. She had been seen. She had been heard. Maestro Vance cleared his throat loudly, trying to get control of the room. He walked to the center of the stage, waving his hands slightly, signaling for the students to calm down. But the applause didn't stop immediately. It took a long time for the cheering to die down. When it finally did, the room was buzzing with electric energy. The students were whispering to each other, looking at Elena with wide eyes and expressions of awe. Vance turned to look at Elena. The coldness was gone from his eyes, replaced by a grudging respect that he clearly didn't want to feel but couldn't deny. He adjusted his jacket, trying to compose himself. He looked at the audience, ready to speak. For a second, it seemed like he might try to take credit for her performance, or give some backhanded compliment about how she finally listened to his advice. But before he could say a word, Elena stood up. She didn't wait for him to critique her. She didn't wait for his approval. She knew that her performance spoke for itself. She didn't need a gold star from him to know that she had done something amazing. With a calm dignity, she simply nodded once to the audience, not a bow of submission, but a bow of thanks and respect to the people who had supported her. She walked off the stage, her head held high. The moment she left the piano, Maestro Vance was left standing there alone in the spotlight. He looked at the empty bench, then at the cheering crowd. He opened his mouth to give his critique, but he stopped. He realized that there was nothing he could teach her today. She had taught him a lesson instead. As Elena walked down the aisle of the concert hall, the students reached out to pat her on the back as she passed. Some of them were strangers she had never spoken to before, but they were grinning at her like she was their best friend. She felt lighter than air. the humiliation she had felt earlier was completely gone, burned away by the fire of her own success. She walked out of the hall and into the fresh air of the afternoon. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs. She looked at her hands, the same hands that had played the impossible piece just minutes ago. They looked ordinary, but she knew they held power. She knew now that she didn't need to be loud to be strong. She didn't need to be arrogant to be confident. She just needed to be herself, and to play her own music, no matter who tried to stop her. Inside the hall, Maestro Vance finally spoke to the class. He sounded tired, and a little bit humbled. "That," he said quietly, "is what happens when you stop playing safe." But Elena was already gone, walking down the street, carrying the music in her heart, ready for whatever challenge came next.